Okay, welcome back to part two of the lecture on verbal behavior. So, now after giving you what I hope was a big, broad overview of verbal behavior and some things to think about with regards to words and thoughts and the difference between those, and trying to clear up that the same exact word or clumps of words sometimes can be a mand, sometimes they can be attacked, sometimes they can even be an interverbal, and even sometimes the same words can be a coex. So remember, we need to look at function, right? What is the purpose of saying these words if we're talking about vocal behavior? All right, so what you've previously been exposed to, though, is more of the structure or the form, the formal properties of language and verbal behavior. And this is much more topographically based. What do the words look like? How do sounds and symbols, consonants and vowels combine to create different sounds, to create different words? But behavior analysts oftentimes, and it's not that we don't think that topography and form is important, it absolutely is, especially when you're talking about individuals' strengths and weaknesses and abilities to be able to engage in vocal speech. So structurally, that stuff is very important, but behavior analysts typically focused on function of verbal behavior. Why? What's the payoff for engaging in saying certain words or writing certain words? What is the reinforcers that maintain those? So here's what most of you have been exposed to early on in school, right? I was never exposed to a behavior analytic conceptualization of language. But here's what you've been exposed to, right? Here are different, how we make different sounds to make different words. We need to have grammatically correct, put together words, semantics and meaning of different kind of words. So these are the things that we have typically, and these are all getting at formal descriptions of components of language. But it's very much what I call the structure or the foundation of verbal behavior. Now, here's where we get a little bit closer to considering function, and this probably is getting at this grouping of verbal behavior is getting closer to looking at function because we're talking about splitting up certain words as things, person, places, and things, or action words, or describing words. And so these do get at function, but they will never tell you, though, why you said a specific word. And that is truly getting at the function of why we say certain words versus other words versus saying nothing at all sometimes. Um, but what we typically look at is not necessarily trying to clump language by noun, verb, and those kinds of structure and function. But we typically look at what kind of antecedent stimuli set the occasion for us to say certain words and what kind of consequences will maintain those us saying those words. So one common misconception, though, Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior was that he rejected all these other ways of understanding, classifying, studying language. And it's not that he dismissed those, he just didn't find those classifications to be very helpful with regards to trying to figure out why, what causes us to say certain words. And remember, as behavior analysts, we're oftentimes posed with trying to teach somebody a verbal repertoire or language or communication system where it hasn't developed naturally. Where it hasn't, most people are not, don't have to be directly taught how to talk. They typically learn it through at least initially listening to sounds in the environment. And that's actually very an interesting point is that if you look at infants when they first start to make sounds, they will actually make sounds that are present in all languages, whether it's Arabic or Spanish or English or Mandarin. Um, Babies will produce sound. So we probably are genetically predisposed to produce sounds and make sounds. But if you watch and observe infants over time, as they hear sounds around them, you'll see a natural pruning of certain sounds that they hear around them, and pruning of sounds actually that they don't hear around them. So what they do is they will start to make sounds that they've heard in their environment more than those other sounds. And that's probably maintained by automatic reinforcement. And the hypothesis is that hearing, an infant hearing itself, make sounds that are present in the environment that it's heard before from other people is more reinforcing than sounds that they have never heard before. And then eventually they make some sounds that sound like ball or heaven forbid mama or dada. And then all of a sudden all heck breaks loose, right? And the social world changes. And that infant then learns that, oh, this is something that I can use in order to interact with my environment and get the environment to change, right? Everybody drops everything and runs over the first time they think they've heard their child say a real word. So it's kind of an interesting look at potentially how language develops from a combination of both a biological and a behavior analytic environmental component. All right, so that leads us right in. There's these three different theories: biological, which is mostly Chomsky, related to this innate predisposition to develop language. Cognitive folks who think that there's something dramatically different about our words and our thoughts, and then behavior analytic or environmental. All right. So the biological theory states that language is a function of physiological processes and functions, and it's absolutely innate, these physiological processes. But we also know of some horrible neglect and abuse cases where kids have been reared in a closet. And clearly, these individuals, or the wild boy of Avalon, if you've ever heard of that story of the boy that was potentially raised by wolves out in the I think Peruvian jungle someplace. So we know that if there's absolutely no model around them for language, that language doesn't develop. Now that doesn't mean that we're not predisposed to make sounds. It's just that then we need an environmental effects and modeling to take over. So the cognitive approach is going to state that language is controlled by internal processing systems that accept, classify, code, and encode, and then store verbal behavior, very much like the computer metaphor. And we know this is wrong, right? Grandpa isn't lying to you when he tells that same story over and over and over again. What happens when we're trying to remember something is we recreate it. I remember, and then I did this, and then that happened, and then, oh yeah, I remember this happened. And so every time Grandpa tells that story, he's going to remember it slightly different, right? There's no actual computer in his brain holding that memory where he can just regurgitate it back exactly the same. It's recreated each time. Okay, so Skinner published this conceptualization that reconceptualized the verbal behavior and stopped looking so much at structure of it and started to look at the function. Why do we say certain words? And it's almost always the case, unless you're singing in the shower, that vocal behavior, when we talk to other people, it's predominantly to engage them and get a reaction and to have some sort of effect on them. And that's why doing these video lectures and even talking in the Blackboard Live Collaborate sessions is very difficult when there's absolutely no feedback because from the listener, because that's exactly what Skinner's point is that the only reason that you would say certain words, especially in the presence of other people, would be to have some sort of effect on them. Or they are providing you with a stimulus for you to engage in certain behaviors. Okay, so Chomsky was a huge critic. He just lambasted it. He said it was very, from Skinner's perspective, condescending and almost aggressive. And Skinner thought that the way that Chomsky wrote this kind of scathing critique of Skinner's account for verbal behavior, that there would be no way that he could get Chomsky to understand, because clearly it was a big misunderstanding of Skinner's points. And he also just took exception with the tone and aggressiveness of the attack on Skinner's new way of kind of looking at language development and verbal and vocal behavior. Okay, so Skinner proposed that it's absolutely learned behavior and that it's acquired, extended, and maintained by the exact same types of environmental variables and principles that maintain other non-language or overt behaviors. And what's tricky here is that sometimes our thoughts, right, our private events, those are just behaviors also. We just don't push air through our vocal cords when we engage in private events or thinking. You're doing the exact same thing as talking, only not pushing air through these vocal cords. So Skinner looked at this and said, you know what? Sometimes external environmental events occasion us to say and think certain things, but other times we provide those cues ourselves. We're thinking to ourselves, and I remember this, and you're kind of recreating, and that's providing you with a stimulus for another thought and another thought. So it's not always that all of our thoughts come from, and they don't, external stimuli. We provide our own stimuli sometime for certain thoughts and the next thought by the thoughts that we have in our head. And those are, though, absolutely no different than any other behavior, and certainly no different than in talking, just that we're not pushing air. Okay, through our vocal cords. So the purpose of verbal behavior is that it's reinforced through mediation of another person's behavior. All right. So this is getting at that we don't typically sit in a room by ourselves and talk out loud. We may sit in a room and think, but we typically don't push air through our vocal cords. And anytime somebody's talking, it's typically to kind of typically engage somebody or get a certain reaction out of somebody. All right. So this is what I was getting at earlier, is that there's this interaction or dance and back and forth between a speaker and a listener. And anytime, if you ever have somebody that just stops communicating, talking back, or engages in very little kind of feedback to somebody that's talking, usually somebody, and that's extinction, right? Usually somebody else will then quit talking to them. So there's very much of this back and forth between speaker and listener, much that way that we went through that little quick mini breakdown of that back and forth between about the vacation where we did in video clip 1. All right, so the listener must learn how to reinforce the speaker's verbal behavior, meaning that listeners are taught to respond to words and interact with speakers. Okay. So verbal behavior, it's a very much of a technical term. When we're talking about verbal behavior, it's a complete new meaning, independent of Skinner's usage. And so when he talks about verbal behavior, he is talking about something very different typically than traditional psychology. All right, so if verbal behavior is just another behavior, right? So, and these thoughts, these private events that we have in our heads, those are also just another examples of behaviors. They're then sensitive to these three things, right? Motivating variables, right? Discriminative stimuli signaling the availability of reinforcement, and then specific consequences happening based on our verbal behavior. Okay, so this three-term contingency, right? These antecedents and then the behavior and then the consequence, those are the verbal operant in the three-term contingency. Okay, now here's where we really get into the different components. Mands, and we talked about that earlier, those specify the reinforcers. Tax, right? So it's requesting a reinforcer for man. Tax, there's just some sort of stimulus that's present in your environment. You might see something and then, quote, label it, but you're not requesting access to it. You're not going to engage it. You're not going to consume it. Echoic, it's only occurring because somebody told you to say something, right? So say ball and you say ball. Intraverbal, remember, those are typically your only reason you're saying them is because of an antecedent stimulus, but it's not echoic. There's not a one-to-one correspondence, right? Say ball and then you say ball. An intraverbal would be like you answering a question, or somebody saying, "What's that thing? We get it, we ride, it's got four wheels," and then you say, "Oh, it's a car." Well, you're only saying it. You're not demanding to get a car. The car's not present. You're not tacting for a car. You are only saying a car because somebody was engaging and giving you a stimulus, a verbal behavior stimulus, and then you are responding. Textual would be written, and transcription would be copying. Okay, so I'm not going to take you all the way through because we've gone through these a couple of different times. I'm going to let you read more about mand tax and intraverbals and echoics. And I wanted to get to just a final thing. Okay, so I like this slide a lot. Identifying verbal operants. So does a motivating operation control the response form? All right, so if you're being motivated, right, that means that there's a reinforcer and you're going to specify it. And that's a mand, right? So does an SD control the response form? All right, so is this something just signaling, whether it's an SD for you to gain, remember, and if it's going to be attacked, some sort of generalized social reinforcer? Is the SD nonverbal, right? Is it something that you can hear, something you can, something you can see, something you can smell, something you can feel? If yes, then the operant is at least in part attacked. If the SD is verbal, if yes, then is there a point-to-point correspondence, right? Is there exact copying? Well, if it is, then that's an echoic, right? If it's not, it's an intraverbal. Okay, so that's the difference in how you try to sort those out. Okay, so a lot of times when we are engaging in some private events and thinking and even kind of self-talking or singing out loud in the shower, those are all examples of where this verbal behavior is being strengthened or reinforced by automatic reinforcement, where the reinforcer is directly produced by engaging in the behavior. And this is something hard to understand, is that you've got to kind of separate out verbal behavior that's maintained by just the stimulation produced by saying the word or writing the word, or is it with regards to a social environment and trying to have an impact and influence other people? Okay. All right. So here's where we get into the issue of private events and thoughts. And I've covered this previously, but I just wanted to take you through this slide right here. What is commonly referred to as thinking involves overt stimulus control and private events, covert stimulus control. Okay? So sometimes there's external events that cause us to think certain things, and sometimes we have it inside our head. Certain thoughts are be a stimulus for the next thought, for the next thought, for the next thought. All right, so the analysis of private stimulation and how it acquires stimulus control is complex because of two problems, right? One, the participant can directly observe the private stimulus, but the applied behavior analyst can't. All right, so this is stuff that happens inside the body, and we can't see it, count it, but we can measure it sometimes in indirect ways. Private stimulus control of verbal episodes in the natural environment will likely remain private. So sometimes when something happens in the natural environment and cues us to think something, we don't necessarily say it out loud. So it's hard sometimes to know whether somebody has had a thought or not. And then, of course, we're reliably inaccurate at reporting our own behaviors and feelings. Okay, so language assessment. We typically don't do standardized expressive and receptive language inventories and trying to figure out where somebody's at. We typically start by taking an inventory of, well, what's their repertoire? How functional are they with manding? How functional? How well are they at labeling and tacting? And if you've ever talked to somebody that doesn't engage in interverbal behavior, it's really hard to keep a conversation with them. So we look at their skills at being able to engage in interverbal behavior, and then we take a direct teaching component where we actually teach these different components of man from a functional perspective, right? What are they going to get as a payoff for these different kinds of types of language and verbal communication. Okay, so and that's just what we talked about. And then here's another interesting thing. Um, just because we can teach somebody to tact something does not mean that they will also then know how to use it as the other forms. It does not necessarily mean that they will learn how naturally generalize to mand for those. And sometimes when somebody will mand for something, they sometimes won't tact it. So we have to actually train these different kinds of components of verbal behavior. All right. And mand training, I think we've talked about several times before. Okay, there. I'm going to call this to an end and close the second and last component to the video lecture on verbal behavior.